Continuing on with the reproductive system, we'll begin the female reproductive system. And as I began with in the males, we started to talk about the general anatomy that we have. And so with the females, again, we have gonads. Those are the ovaries, and then those ovaries produce gametes, our ova, or the oocytes, the eggs that we have there, and then additionally produce hormones for the reproductive process and the rest of the body as well. In order to help out, just like the male, there are a series of ducts. So we have essentially tubes that are going to get things to where they need to go. So we have the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes, the uterus, the vagina, all are helping with the reproductive process. And then with the female, essentially the genitalia themselves are divided up into both internal and external, with the ovaries and all of the associated ducts being the internal organs, and then the external organs being those of primarily the labia and the outer structures that we can find as well. So overall, inside the pelvis is where we're going to find essentially all of the organs that are with reproduction. And so we have things in terms of the reproductive process, the ovary kind of tucked back in there. We have the fallopian tubes and all of the structures of the uterine tubes themselves, the uterus, the vagina, and then the external genitalia in terms of the labia, the clitoris, things like that in terms of those structures. The ovaries are the structures that are going to be the primary source of things like the hormones and those of the oocytes themselves that are going to be produced. And as such, they're in a sense always just kind of not really floating in the pelvis, but they are just kind of out there. And so there is a series of ligaments that are going to help to hold both the ovaries as well as the uterus in place and kind of keep them from moving around at times on there. And so we have things like the ovarian ligaments, the round ligaments, suspensory ligaments, the mesovarium, which are all going to help to hold in addition to the uterosacral ligament. These are going to hold essentially the uterus and the ovaries all in place. And so front, back, sideways, they're holding things in places to the lateral sides, anterior, posterior, every direction, just kind of anchoring things down in the structures of the pelvis itself. So here we can see a picture of those structures that are there within the pelvis. And again, similar to what we saw with the male in terms of the pictures, everything here is kind of straightened out. And so everything's kind of brought into a straight line, whereas normally the uterus would be kind of tilted forward over the bladder. The bladder would be basically in front of the uterus and the vaginal canal there. But for ease of picture, everything's been straightened out. And so we can see that we have ligaments going out the sides, especially that of the broad ligament, which contains three different portions, the mesosalpinx, the mesovarium, and the mesometrium. And then we have the ligaments that are going to anchor things anteriorly. We have the round ligament. What we can't see here really is the uterosacral ligament. So much kind of going posteriorly is kind of embedded there in part of the broad ligament. That's there that would go towards the posterior side. And then continuing outward would that be of the ovarian ligament kind of going from the uterus out towards the ovary itself. So the ovaries, just like the testes, need a blood supply, and that's going to come from those gonadal arteries once again. So ovarian arteries now, as we know that they are coming to the ovaries themselves, these are going to come down to the ovaries and then also extend out towards the uterus as well. And bring in those structures that we just saw in the last slide there, all of the blood supply into all of the ligamentous structures as well. Just like the testes were, the ovaries are surrounded by the tunica albuginea. Here we don't have a tunica vaginalis because there's no abdominal wall covering over the ovaries themselves, so that one is missing compared to that of the um, testes. And so this surrounds the outer structure of the epithelial cells of the ovaries themselves there. The ovaries contain follicles. These follicles are in varying stages of development within the ovaries themselves. And so there are two ovaries. And so primarily only one of those ovaries is going to produce an oocyte uh, with each cycle. And so we may see different stages of development of the follicles in either one of the ovaries at any given time that are there. And so surrounding a given follicle, we have a series of cells that are there. And so we have follicular cells, we have granulosa cells that surround them um, in terms of the structures that are there. And depending upon essentially the timing is going to dictate kind of which type of follicle we're going to see. And so we start off with primordial follicles that are there. And this can be distinguished by basically seeing the oocyte and then seeing only a single layer of cells surrounding it. So they're going to be barely visible because they're going to be kind of like squamous-like cells. They're going to be nice and flat. The primary follicle, as it starts to develop, is going to increase those layers of cells surrounding it into cuboidal cells. These are going to be a couple layers that surround it, and again, they're going to surround the whole oocyte itself. Going from the primary follicle to the secondary follicle, we're now going to increase the number of cells that are surrounding it, as well as start to develop a antrum on the inside. And so essentially, rather than just having an oocyte and then having some cells surrounding it in a couple of different layers that are there, now this is going to start to develop a space inside where we have essentially fluid surrounding it as well. And so we're going to have some fluid inside that antrum, and that's going to start to increase in size. As we continue from that secondary follicle all the way up until a Graafian follicle, this is our matured follicle at this point that is there. And at this point, we're going to have a very large antrum inside there. So there's going to be a large fluid-filled portion that's inside there. And that's what's going to help to uh, propel the oocyte out during ovulation. And so essentially that follicle is going to be on, there's our ovary there, and the follicle is basically bulging against the side there, ready to rupture. We'll make the oocyte green on the inside there. And then this is eventually going to rupture and burst open, and the oocyte is then going to be propelled outward. That's there. And so the ovulation occurs, bursts out the oocyte that can then head down through the uterine tubes down towards the uterus itself. That Graafian follicle is now going to essentially close up, and it's going to stay, and it's going to become a corpus luteum. And so the cells themselves are going to fill in, and we now have a corpus luteum. That corpus luteum is going to stay there. If pregnancy occurs for the first trimester, if not, it's eventually going to become a destroyed corpus luteum, and there where we're going to have the cells themselves essentially become almost like a scar that is now on the ovary after that ovulation has occurred. So corpus luteum degenerates. It's going to eventually turn into a corpus albicans, where it's no longer functional at that point. And so much better drawings than what I did. We can see those primordial follicles just have thin little layer of cell around them. Primary follicles, so primordial follicles over here, primary follicles have one or two layers of cells. Our secondary follicle starting to develop that fluid-filled chamber, that antrum on the inside there. And then finally our Graafian follicle has nice big antrum, fluid-filled, so that during ovulation, there's fluid to kind of push it out there, and fully developed corpus luteum going to stay there for the remainder of the first trimester of the pregnancy. If there's no pregnancy, that's where it becomes that corpus albicans. So the uterine tubes themselves are going to receive the oocyte. And so what we have to also keep in mind is that here's the ovary, and then here is the uterine tube. The uterine tube, or the fallopian tube there, does not actually seal around the ovary. So although I've kind of kept it a little bit further apart there, it doesn't actually seal around it. It's just there essentially to catch the oocyte after it has been ovulated. And so all of the fimbria that are there, all the little ruffles that I drew in there, these are all ciliated. They have ciliated cells on them, and the tube itself has cilia in it. And that's all going to push that oocyte down through the uterine tubes as it's there. And so the uterine tube itself is divided up into different portions depending upon where we're at there. And so the fimbria are the little finger-like projections that are at the very end there. And again, those are ciliated that are there. We then move into the infundibulum, kind of like a funnel, moving into the ampulla. And then the ampulla is going to continue down towards the uterus and then become the isthmus. That's there. So again, there's no contact between the ovary and the uterine tubes. And so although there's in a sense light contact between the two, there's nothing physically sealing them to one another. And so it's those cilia in the fimbria that are helping to create fluid movement that's going to make its way into the uterine tube itself. That uterine tube then is going to push the oocyte down towards the uterus. So smooth muscle, peristalsis, cilia pushing it along in terms of the fluid. At some point, there's the potential that, again, I'll kind of draw my uterine tube here, and then the uterus itself, going something like that. At some point, the oocyte may become fertilized. As that one didn't really show up very well. We'll do red. And so there's the little sperm that's coming along. And typically, fertilization is going to occur somewhere along the tube there. All depends upon when the sperm was in the vaginal canal, its journey up through the uterus and into the uterine tubes themselves, and then same thing with the oocyte. Kind of depends on, was the sperm kind of already on its way, and so maybe it meets it up here. Was the oocyte already on its way, and the sperm finds it closer towards the uterus on there as well. And so we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of between 24 and 72 hours um, between intercourse and ovulation in order for the two of them to become combined with one another. So from the uterine tubes, we go to the uterus. And so inside the uterus, we now have the place for a couple of things to occur. One is going to be obviously the development of the eventual fetus inside the uterus itself. Two is that the uterus basically has to grow a functional layer of tissue in order for that fertilized egg to implant into. So it has a couple of different structures to it in terms of what we have. And so it's a hollow organ. It's relatively thick walled. It's got lots of smooth muscle inside of it that's there. It looks something like this, kind of like a bulb or something like that. And so just like the stomach, we had the fundus at the top. We kind of have the body in the middle that's there. It comes down into the isthmus where we then have the, I need to do something, oops. like so, in terms of the cervix and the cervical canal. That's there. And so um, the structures themselves there are more for the need to kind of see where things are at in terms of implantation and so on, as far as what's going on inside the uterus itself. So if we were to do something like a pelvic exam, we would essentially see the cervix. And so the cervix, and more so the cervical canal, is what would be visible through a pelvic exam. And so the external os and kind of the little bit of the cervix projecting down into the vagina, the neck there, is the structure that we would actually see. That's there. That external os, and so if this is the cervix going up, so we have the external os here, we have the internal os here, and then in between the two is the cervical canal. That's there. And so in doing things like a pap smear, that's where it goes up and is going to take a sample of the tissue there right at the cervical canal, and uh, look for cells that are potentially abnormal inside the external os and the cervical canal itself there, during a pap smear. Um, Glands are going to secrete mucus onto the cervix, and depending upon the state of the cervix, as far as the day of the cycle is concerned, it does go through some changes. And so early on, the uterine cycle, it begins at the first day of menses. And so here we have day 3. Menstruation is still occurring. We can see that that external os is still open. By day 6, though, after menstruation, the cervical os is relatively closed. Day 14 there, which is typically our day of ovulation, the os is opened. And so it's essentially ready to receive sperm at that point. Day 22 there, it has closed, the mucus has thickened, it's essentially ready for pregnancy. And then day 27 there, just before menstruation, again, it's still closed, but getting ready for menstruation, so the mucus is starting to thin there. Birth control, we have basically the same days there, all throughout that we just looked at, and we can see that the birth control essentially makes it so that the cervix is closed and thick mucus all throughout the entire cycle. Mentioned before that the uterus needs to be held in place, and it's done so by various ligaments that we have there. And so the largest of which is commonly referred to as the broad ligament. And so the broad ligament itself extends essentially all the way from the fundus all the way down to the cervix, on the outside and lateral portions of the uterus itself. To the sides, we have the ovarian ligaments. So this is going to come basically from the fundus out towards the ovary and help to hold the ovary away from the uterus itself. The uterosacral ligament extends posteriorly. It's going to go back towards the sacrum, and so that's going to anchor it in the back. So the broad ligament was lateral, the uterosacral ligament is posterior, and then the round ligaments hold it in place anteriorly. Those round ligaments are a little bit unique in that they're going to follow essentially the same pathway as the vas deferens. So the ductus deferens, the vas deferens continues out through the abdominal wall, down through the inguinal canal, and goes all the way to the testes. Here, the round ligaments are going to follow that same pathway, but it's going to end up essentially embedded into the labia majora. So it's following that same pathway, the labia and the scrotum being of similar structure. Due to the placement of the uterus in the pelvis, it's essentially sitting in between the colon and that of the uh, urinary bladder. It's going to create what we call pouches. And so we have these little spaces that exist behind and in front of the uterus. And so we have a rectouterine pouch, which is posterior. This is between the rectum and the uterus. And then we have a vesicouterine pouch, which is in between the uterus and the bladder. And so It creates these little kind of wells, so to speak, in between there. And so here we have the rectouterine pouch on the posterior side, the vesicouterine pouch on the anterior side. And this can be useful in things like trauma, things like that, as fluid will tend to collect down in those particular areas themselves. The uterus itself said was a big, thick, muscular walled organ made up primarily of the muscle. So we've got lots of myometrium there. This is our middle layer. What we just saw there on the picture was essentially the perimetrium. So that was the outermost layer, and that also had the visceral peritoneum surrounding it. And then we have the endometrium, the very inside of the uterus itself. So if we were to go up through the cervical canal, it's the endometrium that we would find on the inside of the uterus. And it's the endometrium that is going to essentially grow and be sloughed off with each cycle. So here we have the uterine wall itself as far as the endometrium goes. It's divided into two major layers. We have the outer functional layer, and then we have the inner basal layer. So the functional layer out here, the basal layer here. The functional layer is the part that's going to get sloughed off with each cycle if there's no pregnancy. The basal layer stays there all the time. And then lastly, we have the myometrium here in the middle with all of the smooth muscle, and then kind of not on the picture there, eventually going into the endometrium as well. So the endometrium is the structure that is the functional portion of the uterus. And truly the functional part is the stratum functionalis. This is where, through the influence of hormones, the functional layer is going to grow through the first portion of the cycle. And then eventually at the very end of the cycle, it will be then shed with menstruation. That's there. If pregnancy does occur, that stratum functionalis is going to continue to grow, and that's what's going to provide the blood supply needed in order for the placenta to get all the nutrients that the developing embryo fetus is going to need. The basal layer, the stratum basalis, essentially stays there all the time, and it's going to be the structure where the functional layer actually grows from. Blood supply comes in, and we have the uterine arteries themselves coming in. These are coming off of the internal iliacs. So remember back to our blood supply into the pelvis. We had the abdominal aorta. We had, I'll draw it kind of big there, the common iliacs, and then internal iliacs came off down into the pelvis. Those are going to come and give us the uterine arteries as well. And so common, internal, and then external iliacs as they go on out from there. Those are going to come into the uterus, and then many branches are going to head through the wall itself. And eventually, what we just saw there on the last picture was the arcuate arteries ring down along the stratum basalis. That's going to give up our radial arteries. That's going to give up our spiral arteries heading up into the functional layers themselves. And so from that basal layer itself, the straight arteries continue on up, and then the spiral arteries move upwards as well, but the straight arteries don't go quite that far into the functional layer as it goes. The spiral arteries are the ones that are going to essentially kink. They're going to stop their blood supply to the functional layer, and that's going to effectively kill the functional layer. So it stops the blood supply, it starves it of nutrients and oxygen, and then all of a sudden, right at menstruation, those blood vessels are going to open up back again, and it's basically going to push all of that endometrium, that functional layer, off of the rest of the structures that are there. Along there. Blood does come back out through veins and essentially comes into larger and larger structures called sinusoids, and those are going to eventually drain away from the uterine wall itself. The vagina is the last tube structure that we have in terms of reproductive organs here. It's going to extend from the cervix towards the external wall of the body itself. That is there, and so it comes out towards the perineal region of the body itself. Eventually comes out towards the vulva. The bladder is just anterior to the uterus, which makes the bladder basically kind of on top of the vaginal canal itself as well. And so the urethra is going to extend along that anterior wall of the vagina itself there. And so it's going to be kind of embedded in along the wall as it makes its way out of the body as well for that. The vaginal canal is there for copulation, it's there for birth, it's there for menstruation. And so it has a few different functions that it serves for the female reproductive system. Similar to that of the uh, uterus, it has a few different layers to it as well. That's there. Lining the vaginal canal, we have stratified squamous epithelium. So we have cells that are in multiple layers there, providing for protection to the vaginal canal itself. Deep to that, we then have smooth muscle. And then eventually surrounding the entire vaginal canal on the inside of the pelvis, we then have the fibroelastic adventitia surrounding it as well. The vaginal canal itself, initially in terms of life, is essentially closed off to the outside world via what's called a hymen. And so this is a structure that closes it off. Generally, it's not completely closed through life itself. It's going to eventually open up through all kinds of processes that can cause the hymen to tear and open up itself. That then enters into the fornix, which is at the very back end of the vagina, and this is where the cervix essentially extends down in, and so it's on either side of the cervix at that point. And so here we have the opening of the vagina itself. We have the perineum, that diamond-shaped structure that is there, going from the pubic bone out to the iliac crest, or I'm sorry, out to the ischial tuberosities, and then back towards the coccyx on the posterior side as well. That is there. There's the potential that the pelvic structures lose some of their supporting properties of all of those ligaments that we talked about before. And so we can have things like uterine prolapse, we can have a cystocele, a rectocele, vaginal prolapse, where essentially the structures that are just mentioned no longer stay in their normal position. They're going to start to move or slide within the pelvis itself there. And so here we have a cystocele on the left. This is where essentially the bladder no longer stays in its normal position and it protrudes posteriorly. This is going to typically then impact the vaginal canal. And so oftentimes this one will present itself during intercourse with either pain or discomfort or a fullness into the vaginal canal that is there. Uterine prolapse is essentially where the uterus starts to move down into the vaginal canal. Again, oftentimes this is symptomatology wise is going to be a feeling of fullness in the vaginal canal or pain or discomfort on intercourse as well. The external genitalia is everything that is in the perineal region there. We have the pudendum. And so this is that diamond-shaped structure that extends downward from the mons at the most anterior portion that's there and extends and includes all of the structures of the external genitalia. So the mons pubis, just over the pubic symphysis, it's a fatty kind of structure that is there, provides for protection of the pubic symphysis that is there. We then have the labia majora and labia minora. The labia majora are the outermost covering to the vaginal canal itself. As we said before, this is homologous to the male scrotum. The labia minora are just inside and a little bit more medial compared to that of the labia majora. And these structures originate from similar structures as that of the ventral side of the penis. And so the same skin that forms the ventral side of the penis forms the labia minora as well. The vaginal canal is a place where there's the potential for outside organisms, whether they be viral or bacterial, to potentially cause problems that are there. And this is where protection is needed of the vaginal canal through mucus secretions. And just on the outside of the vaginal canal, we have the vestibular glands. These vestibular glands are similar to that of the bulbourethra glands. This is going to keep the vestibule itself moist. It's going to lubricate the vestibule just before intercourse as well, and allow for those secretions to be there for intercourse. Just superior to that of the urethra is the clitoris. So the glans clitoris, homologous again to the glans penis, that is there. Very similar to that of the glans penis in terms of the structures inside. There is erectile tissue there as well. It is covered by a prepuce similar to that of the glans penis. That's there. Unlike the glans penis, there is no opening, so there is no urethra that extends from the glans that is there. In terms of the clitoral tissue that's there. Both have essentially the same type of innervation between that of the male and female. It's just that with the female, it is more condensed in terms of the space that's there. And then we talked about the perineum in terms of the structures that are found on its edges. Both males and females have mammary glands. In the male, they tend to not develop, and they also tend to stay relatively small and non-functional. In the female, however, they will develop on the influence of the female hormones at puberty, and they will typically be one of the first signs of puberty itself as well in females. Inside the mammary gland tissue are anywhere between 15 and 25 lobes. They extend outward kind of like spokes from the nipple. The glands themselves, each one of those individual glands has an opening through a lactiferous duct that opens up to the nipples themselves. Surrounding the nipple is an area of kind of roughened pigmented skin called the areola, and that's going to extend outward from the nipple itself onto the skin. Holding the structures of the mammary glands essentially to the chest wall are suspensory ligaments. These are going to embed themselves into the pectoral muscles just beneath the mammary glands that are there. The lobes, individual lobes themselves, are where milk production is going to occur in lactating tissue that's there, and that then becomes expressed out towards the nipple through the lactiferous ducts. So here we have an individual lobe. That lobe has a lactiferous duct that extends out through and up towards the nipple itself. So each one of those lobes will have its own opening on the nipple that is there. The areola extends outward from the nipple along there. The entire tissue is going to be surrounded by adipose. The suspensory ligaments are going to come down and essentially hold the breast tissue towards the pectoral muscles that are underneath there and help to hold them in place. One of the things that comes up when it comes to cancers oftentimes is that if we look at different types of cancers, oftentimes they're in tissues where there's a large amount of cellular turnover. And oftentimes that cellular turnover comes in epithelium. And so breast tissue is no different. And so with breast cancer, there are some risk factors for women. Things like early onset of menses, late menopause. Essentially, the body's been exposed to the female hormones for a long period of time in that case. That's there. Someone who is nulliparous, has no pregnancies, or has had pregnancy late in life, is at a higher risk of breast cancer. Anyone in the family, especially first degree family members having had breast cancer, is a risk factor. The potential for genetics, and so we have the breast cancer genes themselves. However, they are not a definitive as far as cancer. The big thing with breast cancer, however, though, is that oftentimes there are no real uh, risk factors in women who end up with breast cancer. So there's no reason, in a sense, why, or not really reason, but there's no reason why they would have been worried about it necessarily, other than the fact that they had breast tissue. Detection is the key. So breast cancer's survival rate has gone up tremendously over the last 30 years or so. And most of that is due to early detection. And so this is where mammography comes into play, home breast self-examination comes into play, knowing the tissues themselves and following up when something is detected there. And then a whole host of different types of um, treatments depending upon where the breast cancer itself is when it is detected. Has it spread? Has it stayed in just the breast tissues themselves? What part of the breast tissue is it in, etc. On there. Next up, we'll continue to talk about the reproductive system in our next video.